A woman alone is not a woman abandoned. She is not the silent room, the empty cup, the forgotten path. She is the hearth that chose to burn inward, the fire that chose not to entertain, but to alchemize. Modern society watches her with suspicion, labeling her solitude as sadness, her silence as a signal flare. But this judgment is not rooted in truth. It is rooted in fear. Fear of a woman who does not seek permission to exist. To live alone is not to wage war against society. It is to call a truce with the self. It is not rebellion. It is remembrance. The ancient philosophers whispered of this kind of power. Lao Tzu said, "He who conquers others is strong. He who conquers himself is mighty." And what is a woman in solitude if not a quiet conqueror, wrestling not with the world, but with her own reflection? In the depths of silence, she hears what the world drowns out, the voice that was never permitted to speak. Carl Jung called it individuation, the slow, sacred unfolding of the self. For a woman, this path often begins not in the arms of others, but in the mirror of solitude. Alone, she meets her animus, the inner masculine energy, not as opposition, but as integration, not as dominance, but as wholeness. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And so she strips herself of the roles she inherited: daughter, caretaker, beauty, muse. These masks fall away not with anger, but with grace. Solitude becomes not a sentence, but a ceremony. There in the quiet, she reclaims the sacred feminine, not through rejection, but through redefinition. The feminine that society feared, intuitive, fierce, sovereign, a femininity not designed for gaze, but for genesis. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, but in a world that sells identity like perfume, knowing oneself becomes an act of radical clarity." Solitude offers that mirror, and it does not flatter, it reveals. But it is not easy, because to be alone is to face the shadow. That dark reflection society taught her to hate, the independence mislabeled as arrogance, the wisdom mistaken for coldness, the fire mistaken for danger. She was told that too much solitude would make her bitter. But what if it makes her sovereign? Nietzsche understood this. He wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." And when a woman steps outside the tribe's expectations, choosing silence over spectacle, solitude over social performance, she does not disappear. She returns to the root, to the source, to the self. The oracle at Delphi knew this truth. Know thyself, not please thyself, not prove thyself. Know thyself. This was the feminine temple, not built of stone, but of solitude. Virginia Woolf, a modern voice in the lineage of sacred aloneness, declared, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." But she meant more than fiction. She meant truth, creation, identity. The room was not just physical, it was psychological, a border between her and the projections of the world. So let the world whisper. Let them mislabel. Because while they watch for signs of loneliness, she is undergoing transformation, not rejection, resurrection. And as she walks the path, alone but not lonely, she does not escape love. She discovers its truest source, herself. Her solitude is not her exile, it is her homecoming. Solitude for the woman who chooses it is not absence, it is presence intensified. To be alone consciously is not to live without others, it is to live without illusions. There is a profound difference between escaping society and transcending it. The former is fear, the latter is wisdom. In the quiet space of solitude, the voices of the world fade, and a deeper voice rises. One that was buried beneath the expectations, the social scripts, the myths of dependence. It is the voice of the inner self whispering, "You are already complete." Simone de Beauvoir once wrote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." What does it mean to become? It means shedding, not only the projections of others, but the unconscious agreements made with culture. It means taking back authorship of one's story, and that is precisely what solitude allows. The edit, the rewrite, the original script. The myth of the lonely woman is a cultural defense mechanism, a way of guarding the status quo. Because when a woman finds wholeness without needing others to validate her, she becomes dangerous, not in destruction, but in definition. She is no longer waiting, no longer orbiting someone else's sun. Khalil Gibran, the mystic poet, saw this clearly. Let there be spaces in your togetherness. He spoke of love not as possession, but as two flames dancing in the space between. But before one can dance in the space between souls, one must first light the fire within, and that requires silence. Solitude becomes the alchemical container for transformation. The woman alone becomes both the question and the answer. She becomes the seeker and the oracle. She becomes the soil and the bloom. This process is not always luminous. Sometimes solitude is storm, because within the silence is the shadow. Jung described the shadow as the parts of ourselves we exile, fears, desires, wounds. For many women, the shadow includes the parts deemed too much by the world, too loud, too smart, too wild, too independent. But when these aspects are faced, not feared, something miraculous happens. They become power, not power over others, power as presence. Jean-Paul Sartre, in a moment of existential clarity, said, "Freedom is what you do with what's been done to you." And so the woman in solitude does not escape her past. She reclaims it. She picks up each discarded piece, each silenced part, and weaves herself anew. Not according to the world's narrative, but her own. This is not isolation, this is integration. Like the ancient goddess Artemis, who roamed the forest untamed, not as a rebel but as one with nature, so too does the modern woman find in solitude a return to her primal knowing. Artemis was not anti-society. She was pro-self. She did not need to be seen to be whole. There is power in invisibility, because when no one is watching, a woman can ask, "Who am I when I am not performing?" And the answer does not come immediately. It arrives like a tide, soft and certain, whispering, "You are not what they told you. You are what you remember when the world forgets your name." This remembrance is sacred. It is not bitter. It is not cold. It is not lonely. It is real. As the mystic Rainer Maria Rilke said, "The only journey is the one within." And for the woman walking alone, that journey is not a detour. It is the destination. To walk alone is not to walk in absence. It is to walk in essence. What the world sees as emptiness, she knows as sacred space. Space to breathe, to unbecome, and to reawaken. The woman alone is not defined by who she walks without, but by what she walks toward. Truth, presence, the unshakable ground of self. In solitude, she does not retreat from life. She enters it fully. This is the paradox of spiritual solitude. It appears still, yet moves mountains within. It is not rejection of society, but a reorientation of value. Not turning one's back on others, but turning inward with reverence. As Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." A woman alone discovers this truth not as theory, but as experience. She learns to sit with herself, and in that stillness, she finds both the ache and the answer. She confronts the silence, and in it, she discovers that the silence was always her native tongue. The process is mythic. It is not a detour. It is the hero's journey. Only this time, the hero is not slaying dragons. She is facing her own reflection. To the external world, this journey is invisible, but within, tectonic shifts occur.
She asks, "What do I believe?" and finds that most beliefs were borrowed. She asks, "What do I desire?" and realizes desire had often been scripted by someone else's dream. She asks, "Who am I?" and for the first time, the answer is not echoed, but original. This is not an identity crisis. This is an identity unveiling. Soren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, once wrote, "The most common form of despair is not being who you are." And so she chooses solitude not to escape despair, but to dissolve it. She peels away the layers of performance and perfection and discovers that behind every mask was not a void, but a soul, wild, radiant, awake. This is where solitude becomes sacred. Because in this space, femininity is not erased, it is remembered. Not the femininity that bends to please or waits to be chosen, but the femininity that creates, intuits, leads. The femininity that was never meant to be ornamental, but elemental. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Jungian analyst and author of Women Who Run with the Wolves, speaks of the wild woman archetype, the instinctual self, the untamed core. In solitude, a woman meets this part of her, not in rebellion, but in reunion. She is no longer defined by who wants her. She is defined by who she is. And in this state, love is no longer a transaction. It is a gift. She does not need a partner to complete her because she has already united the inner opposites. She has faced her animus, embraced her anima, and stood in the fire of her own becoming. As the Upanishads say, from joy springs all creation. By joy it is sustained, and into joy it returns. The woman who has found joy in her own being no longer chases fulfillment. She radiates it. She does not beg to be seen. She sees herself. She becomes sovereign, not as an act of ego, but of essence. And so the world may still ask, why is she alone? But the real question is, how did she find such peace in her own presence? The answer is simple. She stopped searching for herself in others, and she remembered that the home she was looking for was always her own heartbeat. Aloneness, when chosen with consciousness, is not a condition. It is a calling. A calling not to flee from the world, but to return to the self, undistorted. In a society built on mirrors, on likes, follows, validation, solitude becomes the last sanctuary where a woman can look into herself without distortion. It is in this sanctuary that she sees not what she should be, but what she is. That room is not just a physical space. It is psychological sovereignty, a place where the mind and soul are free to explore, to expand, to evolve. And that evolution often begins with a rupture, the disillusionment of what one was taught to desire. The woman who chooses solitude must often break through the mythology of romantic completion, the cultural expectation of constant companionship, the subtle suggestion that wholeness lies elsewhere. But once those illusions crack, light enters. She realizes that being alone is not the absence of love, it is the presence of clarity. As Alan Watts once said, muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone. Solitude becomes the stillness that reveals. It uncovers the fears she inherited, the roles she accepted without consent, and the pain she internalized because no one showed her how to set it down. And when she faces those things, truly faces them, something unexpected happens. She no longer needs to be understood by others. She becomes the one who understands herself. This is the death of performance and the birth of presence. She begins to see that many of her past relationships were not built on love, but on need, on mutual avoidance of aloneness. And now, having made peace with that aloneness, she no longer fears it. She no longer trades her freedom for fleeting comfort. Nietzsche said, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." This struggle is not against connection, but against dissolution, against the subtle erosion of one's truth to satisfy the comfort of the collective. The woman who lives alone learns to hold her center amidst this pressure, not in resistance, but in rootedness. She becomes an oak, not unmoved by love, but unshaken by its absence. This rootedness gives rise to a new kind of femininity, one that is not about softness alone, but about strength without performance, creativity without apology, power without domination. The ancient archetypes return, not as myths, but as mirrors. Artemis, wild and untamed, who hunted alone by moonlight. The Oracle of Delphi, who spoke with the voice of the divine from within her cave. Baba Yaga, fierce and terrifying not because she was cruel, but because she belonged to no one. These figures were not feared because they were evil. They were feared because they were free, And freedom, in a world that profits from female dependence, is revolutionary. The solitary woman does not reject love. She simply knows that love is not what saves her. She has already done that herself. In solitude, she learns that love, when it comes, is not to complete her, but to complement her. And if it never comes in the form she imagined, she will not break, because she has already found the love that matters most, the love that does not abandon when the lights are off and the world is silent. The love of the self. There is a quiet revolution happening. It is not televised. It has no slogan, but it changes everything. It is the image of a woman, alone, not lonely, sitting in the stillness of her own presence, unmoved by the noise of the world. She is not waiting. She is not hiding. She is not rebelling. She is remembering. In that stillness, she becomes something the world has not taught her to be, whole, without witnesses. Because the truth is, solitude is not an absence to be filled, but a fullness to be felt. It is not what is lacking. It is what remains when the false has been stripped away. As Jean-Paul Sartre once observed, if you're lonely when you're alone, you're in bad company. But she is not in bad company. She is in the company of her soul. And there, in that sacred place, she does what no external relationship can force. She integrates. Integration is not perfection. It is not closure. It is not the neat wrapping of life into tidy boxes. It is the wild, painful, glorious work of reclaiming all parts of the self, especially the ones disowned. She faces her shadow, and she does not run. She holds the parts of herself that were called too much, too sensitive, too ambitious, too different, and whispers, "You were never too much. You were just never mirrored properly." And this becomes the miracle of solitude. It reintroduces her to her reflection, unfiltered. She no longer requires the gaze of the other to know that she exists. She no longer performs femininity. She embodies it. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the movement toward becoming a fully integrated self, unique, sovereign, and whole. For a woman, this means confronting both the animus, the inner masculine, and the collective shadows cast on the feminine. By choosing solitude, she does not deny love. She refines it. She removes the need from love, the fear from love, the projection from love. What remains is purity, power, presence. As Bell Hooks said, love is an action, never simply a feeling. And the deepest action of love is the one we perform for ourselves, when we decide we are worthy of our own presence. And so the path she walks is neither easy nor conventional. But it is ancient. It is the path walked by mystics, artists, shamans, and seers. It is the path of women who were burned for being too wise, silenced for being too loud, or exiled for being too free. It is the path of the sacred feminine in her purest form, undefended, undomesticated, and unbroken. In a world that commodifies connection, she chooses authenticity. In a culture that equates silence with shame, she reclaims silence as strength. And when she speaks again, because she will, it is not to be heard, it is to reveal. And those who listen will not hear a voice seeking permission. They will hear a voice rooted in truth. This is not rebellion. This is resurrection. The woman who lives alone has not given up on the world. She has simply remembered that the world does not define her. She defines it through the way she loves, creates, walks, and breathes. She is not a mystery because she hides. She is a mystery because she no longer needs to explain. And perhaps the final paradox is this: the woman who lives alone, truly alone, is never truly alone again.
Because in her wholeness, she becomes a world unto herself.
Not a fortress, a temple. And those who enter must do so barefoot in reverence.
And in that temple, solitude is no longer a condition. It becomes devotion. Not to silence, but to listening. Not to escape, but to embodiment. Not to being unseen, but to being fully seen by oneself. The woman who has journeyed through solitude no longer seeks to fit into spaces she has outgrown. She does not bend to be accepted. She does not shrink to be desired. She has walked through her fears, dined with her doubts, danced with her longing, and returned not empty, but vast. As Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, the point of marriage is not to create a quick community of spirit by tearing down and destroying all boundaries, but rather a good marriage is one in which each partner appoints the other to be the guardian of his solitude. But what if no partner comes? Then the solitude remains, not as lack, but as sanctum. The woman who lives alone learns that there is no higher love than the one which allows her to remain herself. She would rather wait for that love than betray herself for imitation. She has been to the depths. She has survived the silence. She has made a home of her own soul. And so she becomes magnetic, not for what she offers, but for what she no longer needs. She becomes luminous not because she was rescued, but because she remembered she was never lost. In a world obsessed with finding the one, she has become the one for herself. And that is the secret most never learn. True love begins when the search ends. Not because love is abandoned, but because it is redefined. It is no longer a searchlight cast outward. It is a fire lit within. And from that fire, she will illuminate others, not to warm them for her own validation, but to remind them that they too carry the spark. Solitude, then, is not the end of the story. It is the return to the beginning, where the woman, unmasked and untamed, meets herself again and whispers, "You were never alone. You were always coming home."